Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, SOH, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, English, MEG 06 American Literature, Block-1 Contexts of American Literature, Unit-4 Some Other Contexts of American Literature, 4.0 Objectives. In my introduction to this block, I had asserted that I would use the block to enlarge upon some contexts of American literature other than the Puritan context which has, till recently, received inordinate attention from American studies scholars as being the only context for the American cultural enterprise including the production of its literary texts. The other contexts thus suppressed included the Quaker context, the Indian context, the black context, and the poor white context, all of which indispensably went into the making of the Puritan self. 4.1 Introduction. The Quaker context, or the context absorbed by the turbulent 1680s in the aftermath of the Republican experiment and before the Glorious Revolution, England and its empire were in the throes of numerous controversies over constitutional liberties and autocratic power. Against this backdrop arose a sect of Christians, inspired by a man named George Fox, who had turned away from every established church, Catholic, Anglican and Puritan in search of the true road to God. These were the Quakers. The Quakers believed that divine guidance was not to be found in any outward church, or even in the Bible, though the latter was of course central to all faith. It was to be found in the voice of conscience, which is God's voice. Neither rituals nor clergy were needed. Even taking the sacraments in church was unnecessary. One's whole life was instead to be a continuing baptism, in the sense of resisting sensual evils, and a continuing communion, in the sense of a union with Christ. The purpose of a religious gathering, what the Quakers called a meeting, was to commune jointly, in silence, with the indwelling Spirit. If a member felt called upon to rise and speak, he was to do so freely and without concern for his lack of clerical training. The Quakers were distrustful of learning, for they felt it led to the sin of pride in self. True preaching came not from a learned and arrogant ministry, they believed, but from within the body of the meeting in the persons of God-called ministers. The Quakers insisted upon living inviolate and orderly lives of thrift and frugality. Every person should have a calling, a committed engagement to work in this world. Even in jail, the Quakers busily set about working at crafts and skills. These habits helped to make them well-to-do merchants, leading to the worry jest that they were people with one foot in the meeting house and the other in the counting house. But though the Quakers had a lot in common with the Puritans, the two sects held theological opinions opposed to one another. The Puritans were horrified by the Quakers' belief in the perfectibility of all human beings. If there is evil in the world, declared the Quakers, it lies in external institutions of hierarchy, power and violence, not inside the human heart. Where Puritans thought of God as supreme authority, and in His image built strong institutions of government, in which the magistrate was central, the Quakers regarded God as absolute love, and in His image built a civil society without supervisory or superintending structures. Thus, the Quakers sought to apply the Sermon on the Mount in the most literal sense, creating a world of equality and fraternity here and now. They aided the poor and the destitute, and were the first to condemn slavery. They believed in complete equality between men and women. Women had leading roles as charismatic leaders in the Quaker movement as well as between everyone in society. They would not refer to anyone as Mr., which originally meant master, called the King Charles, instead of King Charles, and always used the familiar forms thee and thou instead of the more formal you in interpersonal conversation. Since hat honor was insisted upon in 17th century European life, inferiors always took off their head covering in the presence of superiors. Quakers wore theirs even in the king's presence. The Quakers grew in numbers, reaching perhaps 60,000 by the 1680s, but this was in the face of sheer repression. It was common for a Quaker congregation to be fined thousands of pounds for not attending Anglican services, for Quakers by the thousands to be imprisoned or to have their livelihood denied them for not taking oaths. What they wanted, therefore, was to find a place of refuge abroad, some place in the king's empire where they might live in peace and, they hoped, attract converts by the virtue and purity of their lives and religion. For years this searching went on, into the islands of the Caribbean and on the North American mainland. In 1674 a group of Quakers, including the gifted William Penn, joined to buy the western half of New Jersey as their place of settlement. As an oppressed minority, they were acutely conscious of the need for guaranteed fundamental rights, and the constitution that William Penn wrote for West New Jersey, the concessions and agreement, was strikingly liberal. It established an annually elected assembly that was fully independent of the executive. Settlers were guaranteed full due process in court confrontation and of accusers, the right to cross-examination, and the admission of evidence and trial by jury. There was to be neither life imprisonment nor capital punishment, both novel provisions centuries ahead of their age. Everyone in West Jersey was also guaranteed complete religious freedom, for there would be no established state church. Liberal land provisions were offered to attract settlers, and within a few years hundreds of settlers, mainly Quakers, had arrived. All of New Jersey became a royal colony in 1702, the two halves being merged under a unified government that was provided by New York Colony until 1738. A far grander holy experiment was set in motion in 1681. King Charles II had owed a large debt to William Penn's dead father, and to repay it he granted to William Penn, a close friend of the Duke of York, a huge proprietary colony, that is, Penn personally owned the land and had absolute powers of government. Pennsylvania, including what is now Delaware, which had already been settled by Swedes and Dutch. Now, half a century after John Winthrop had taken his company of Puritan settlers to New England to begin their attempt at building a utopian Christian society, Penn and the Quakers set out on a similar adventure. Pennsylvania was outstandingly prosperous from the beginning. Its rich farmlands attracted a constant stream of settlers who produced a bountiful supply of food to be sold abroad. Philadelphia was quickly settled by experienced merchants from London and from towns elsewhere in the colonies. By the mid-18th century, they had made Philadelphia the third commercial city in the British Empire, after London and Bristol. Through personal religious ties, Quaker merchants had contacts all over the North Atlantic commercial world, from Germany to the Caribbean. It was not uncommon for an intermarried network of merchants to connect Madeira, London, Barbados, Newport, and New York, and then work together in assisting one another. In London itself there was a vigorous community of Quaker merchants who aided their counterparts in Philadelphia. In the same letters they sent, along with denominational news, reports on crops, prices and finances also. Pennsylvania's wealthy men soon invested in western lands, reselling at higher prices to incoming farmers. Many of them sought land for the same reason that the aristocracy did in England did, to provide social eminence as well as income, Quaker merchants also were not long in starting to build iron foundries. Because of this, Pennsylvania has been uniquely identified with the metals trade since the colonial days. Based upon this and other enterprises, an aristocracy grew up in Pennsylvania comparable to that of the planters in the Chesapeake and Carolina colonies, the patroons in the Hudson Valley, and the merchant princes of Boston. However, though they were so like the Puritans in their ways of living, if not in their religious beliefs, in one great particular they differed. They could abide dissent, indeed, allowing people to dissent and to believe in and practice their own different faiths in their own diverse ways, was the bedrock of the Quakers' social policy. In turn, this principle would create so great a babel of creeds and sects in their colony of Pennsylvania that their own distinctive identity would be lost. 4. Point to the Indian context, or the context, eliminated. If the Quakers lost their identity due to their own Catholicity, the Indians of New England did not have much of a choice but to do so. You will remember that Indians refers to the original inhabitants of America before the arrival of the English and not to people of India. By the 1670s, the Indians of New England were desperate. Ever since the brief Pequot War of 1637, they had kept their heads low, traded a dwindling supply of furs for guns and alcohol and gems, and watched their cultures, their identity, and their territories declining. Meanwhile, the wealthy and healthy Puritans were growing rapidly in numbers, from 25,000 in 1650 to 50,000 in 1675. Several thousand praying Indians tried to emulate white ways, but a rising generation of proud, younger Indians looked upon them with contempt and burned for revenge against the humiliations their people were suffixing. Metacom, the leader of the Wampanoags, the New Englanders called him King Philip, had for years brooded over his tribe's fate. In 167 he had been forced to accept a treaty of absolute submission to white authority in all land sales. Soon thereafter, there began gathering around him a movement of resistance to the whites. The moment of crisis was approaching. Either the whites were going to be expelled, and the Indians could recapture their pride and dignity with their erstwhile lands, or utter defeat would have to be accepted. When in spring 1675 a praying Indian revealed the Wampanoags' plans, he was put to death. Consequently, 3 Indians accused of the crime were hung under New England's laws, following a white man's trial. Now a guerrilla campaign began against isolated New England villages and settlements. Militia troops were raised to retaliate. The arm went out through all New England, and through the summer of that year an elusive Metacom, joined by other tribes, engaged in battle after battle. In time the whole New England frontier was in flames. The fighting continued for months, on into the winter and then to the spring of 1676. By that time, New England settlers were streaming back to towns nearer the coast, and the upper Connecticut Valley was ravaged. Towns less than 20 miles from Boston were under attack, but the conflict had become one of simple endurance, and the Indians were running literature out of food and firepower. Fleeing westward, they ran into the barrier of the Iroquois, their traditional enemies. Turning back to their ancestral lands, they again came under attack. In the summer of 1676 surrenders began, leaders were executed or sold into slavery in the West Indies. In August 1676 Metacom was slain. The first of the great Indian wars was over, but it had been a shocking holocaust, easily among the most savage and costly of all such conflicts in American history. The 5 tribes of the Iroquois were different from the other Indians whom the colonists encountered. Occupying the Mohawk Valley in New York, their powerful confederacy with its 10,000 people terrified all other interior tribes. They undertook widely ranging campaigns over vast distances, sending other Indians fleeing in terror before them and redistributing the whole interior pattern of tribal residents. Curiously enough, when not at war they were extremely mellow and urbane. The Iroquois based life within their confederacy on arrangements for individual freedom and government by consent of the governed that contrasted sharply with the situation in most European countries. Their principal chiefs were known as powerful reasoners, wise and formidable men who relied on a clear and distinct set of ideas for guidance. Moved by some inexplicable genius, they had been able to construct an enlightened and enduring confederacy in the midst of an Indian world characterized by dissipation and disintegration. Common concerns of the confederated tribes were settled through representative interactive councils and not by the use of force. The prime mover of this inspiring confederation was an extraordinary individual named Hiawatha. Inspired by another extraordinary individual named Degnavida, who had a transcendent vision of universal human bonding, Hiawatha attempted to unify the then endemically conflicting Iroquois tribes by moving back and forth from tribe to tribe, trying to teach them to live peacefully with the rest of the tribes. The government of the Iroquois Confederacy was fashioned thereafter under the guidance of Degnavida and Hiawatha, a completely civil confederacy. It did not allow warriors to be representatives to the federal councils, for they might tend to take warlike stands. Each tribe had a given number of representatives who could be removed for wrongdoing by their own tribes. The capital of the Iroquois League moved about. It was located near the present town of Cazenovia, New York, south of Syracuse. When white men came into contact with the Confederacy in their relationship with white men, the Iroquois tried to play off the inimical French against the friendly British. In order to cement their friendship with the British, the Iroquois became the middlemen in the fur trade, delivering to Albany what would otherwise have gone to Montreal. Thus they ruled virtually uncontested over an empire of thousands of square miles, from the Atlantic to Lake Superior, from Canada to the Tennessee River. Yet it was their alliance with the British that proved to be their undoing, implicating them in the British defeat in the American War of Independence. Thus ended a unique empire devoted to humanitarian ideals of liberty and fraternity, conceived and executed by an Indian people prior to the arrival of the whites and surviving even today in the traditions of the Iroquois who still live in the Mohawk Valley. 4.3 The Black Context, or the context, invisibilized, even as the Indians were encountering the onslaught of white power. Material as well as cultural, the whites were engaged in importing yet another ethnic group into America with the express purpose of exploiting them to erect their own structures of state and civil society. The African slave trade first began in the ISOs, bringing workers to the Spanish Empire and to the large Portuguese possession, Brazil. Indeed, Africans have always made up a larger proportion of the Brazilian population than they ever have that of North America. It was common in large parts of the country for slaves to outnumber whites 3 to 1. Indeed, it could be stated without hyperbole that the influence of Africa upon Brazil was second only to that of Portugal. When the English founded their North American colonies, in the 1600s, people of African descent appeared within them almost as soon as the whites. In a famous event in 1619, the first group of black slaves, possibly indentured servants, disembarked at Virginia. During the 1630 as the first colonial laws were enacted formally establishing the institution of slavery, the Virginians of 1619 were in dire straits. Among them were the survivors from the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time when, crazed for want of food, they roamed the woods for nuts and berries and dug up graves to eat the corpses of those unfortunate fellow colonists who died in batches till, all in all, they were reduced to 60 in number. The Virginians needed labor to grow corn for subsistence and to grow tobacco for marketing. They had just figured out how to grow tobacco, and in 1617 they sent off the first cargo to England earning a decent profit. They could not force the Indians to work for them. They were outnumbered, and while, with superior firearms, they could massacre Indians, they could not capture them and keep them enslaved. The Indians were rough and tough, and at home in these woods as the transplanted Englishmen were not, white servants had not yet been brought over in sufficient quantity. Besides, they did not come out of slavery, and did not have to do more than contract their labor for a few years to get their passage and a start in the land they had arrived at. Such laborers were kept at their work by making settlement difficult so they could not live as independent farmers, or their terms of service were extended, which was often done by various devices, or were kept poor. This produced a permanently turbulent, potentially explosive lower class. The alternative was the use of black slaves. To their credit, the Virginians actually did not create the institution of slavery. Black slaves were commonly available as a regular item of trade. Using slaves, then, meant simply keeping them in the condition, once purchased, and dispensing with the use of those troublesome white servants. Naturally, the English colonists started taking a major role in stimulating the enormous movement of people from Africa to America. Perhaps more people made this crossing, in fact, than from Europe. A conservative estimate is that during the whole course of the slave trade, perhaps 15 million Africans were delivered alive from one end of the America to the other. The number who perished either in Africa during long slave journeys or on the infamous slave ships might approach that figure. Starvation and sicknesses in the slave ships' stinking holds took a frightful toll. The Africans also fought back against their captivity, whenever and wherever they could, in bloody battles with their captors. On other occasion, captives simply flung themselves en masse into the sea to drown, turning in the water to shout derisively before disappearing from sight. Colonists intentionally imported male as well as female slaves, so that the slaves had children, whom the owners got free of charge. Between 1700 and 1750 Virginia, planters acquired about 45,000 slaves, but the black population actually increased during those years from perhaps 10,000 to 100,000. In such a situation, profits could be excellent, for a burgeoning labor supply meant burgeoning sales of tobacco. Gradually slaves were employed in a diversity of jobs, as metal workers, miners, builders and the like. However, their primary utilization continued to be in agriculture, on plantations where gang labor and disciplined group endeavor were practiced. Slavery came to Virginia in a big way when planters stopped buying the contracts of white servants. By the end of 1600s, possibly half of the Virginia labor force consisted of slaves, and the balance swung swiftly in that direction thereafter. The inflow of white indentured servants from England into Virginia dwindled away, which meant that the later inflow of white-fied men into Virginia life also subsided. Now the threat of an angry laboring class of truculent white men was somewhat mitigated. Labor became more or less attached to skin color. All white men increasingly had something to share, whether rich or poor, their status as free whites above enslaved blacks. This made for a powerful bond between white people. No less than the Europeans, the black slaves brought from Africa varied widely in skin color, appearance, stature and culture. They came from ancient societies with highly developed states, some of them so powerful that, except for tiny trading posts, here and there, Europeans made no attempt to conquer the vast interior of Africa, for Africans did not leave their cultural heritage behind when they were forced into slavery. This unique painting, done in 1775 or after, shows slaves passing their few hours of leisure on a Sunday or holiday with a dance. Several identifiably African elements appear in the picture. The drum and banjo-like instrument are both of African origin, as are the scarves and cane used in the tribal dance. The blue and white bandanas worn by two of the women are similar to Yoruba cloth from West Africa. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Collection, Williamsburg, Virginia. Hundreds of years after the slave trade began, slave seekers traded with the literature AFICW off the coastline and sending in boats. They themselves did not trek into the interior and capture slaves. In the great African principalities, as in contemporary late medieval Europe, slavery was widespread. In Europe and Africa, it was simply an extreme form of servantship, applied to captured men and women from outside the nation or faith. Christians in Europe had given up enslaving other Christians, but infidels did not fall within the ambit of humane consideration. The slave in Africa, however, was treated more like a human being who could marry, keep his family together, and progress out of slavery. Only in America, and particularly in the English colonies, did the idea evolve of the slave as a subhuman kind of chattel to be bought and sold like a piece of real estate. In their homelands, the Africans had developed a culture that was not only rich but also intricate. The village unit, in which most Africans lived, had its skilled labor class, which was frequently divided into guilds of potters, weavers, woodcarvers, and metalworkers. Agriculture was a highly organized communal undertaking since the eland belonged to the entire village. In the interior regions, the African economy was largely pastoral, centering on the raising of goats, sheep, and cattle. Great aggregations of interrelated people constituted kinship networks presided over by a patriarch. This person, in consultation with elders, served as judge, administrator, treasurer, and diplomat. African society was embedded in a rich cultural life in which sophisticated sculpturing in bronze, wood, and ivory played an important part in religious observance. Complex musical compositions, involving instruments such as the violin, guitar, flute, zither, harp, and xylophone, enlivened every aspect of life. Dancing likewise was intimately intertwined with daily life. African literature, like the literature of the Indians of America, was basically oral and, like Indian American literature, was rich in scientific information, history, and poetic nuances. For a while, the slave was thought of as an indentured servant, similar in status to but different from an English person laboring in the fields under contract. Certainly, there appeared to have been free blacks in Virginia and Maryland not long after the use of slaves began. This was because English law in the 17th century did not recognize slavery, and there was a considerable period during which the legal status of slaves in the mainland colonies was in question. The uncertainty regarding the black person's position as a slave, however, had been settled long before 1700. Enslaved men and women were clearly owned for life, as were their children. They were not yet fully depressed into the legal condition of a mere piece of property with no democratic or personal rights, but that status was not far away. Eventually, American slavery became one of the most absolute forms of enslavement known to history. Chattel slavery, where marriages were not recognized in law, where slaves had virtually no authority other than their master, existed only in the English-speaking colonies. In India, too, as you know, the custom of bonded labor for life existed under the zamindars or landlords. Certain revolutionary alterations in the English economy over the 17th century had allowed for the release of the entrepreneur from any government controls and consequently granted owners of property, whether in the form of land or goods or chattel slaves, the liberty to handle their property entirely as they desired. That this vastly energized the English economy is without question, but the progress was questionable when looked at through the lens of social and moral values. The planters of Virginia and of the other southern colonies of North America inherited this economic system. They were free to treat their chattel absolutely according to their whims and fancies. The state and the several churches were impotent in the matter of regulating the management of slaves by their masters because financially they were wholly dependent upon their white patrons. Therefore, the peculiar institution of slavery in the English colonies thrived very much under laissez-faire conditions. 4.4 The poor white context, or the context, overshadowed the use of blacks as slaves, in some measure, spared whites from coming to terms with the class schisms within their own society. But the schisms were by no means eliminated altogether. In 1676, 70 years after Virginia was founded, the colony faced a rebellion of white frontiersmen, supported by servants and slaves, a rebellion so intense that the governor had to flee the burning capital of Jamestown, and England decided to send 1,000 soldiers across the Atlantic, hoping to restore order among the 40,000 colonists. This was Bacon's rebellion. Bacon's rebellion began with conflict over how to deal with the Indians who, on the western frontier, constantly threatened those whites who had gone to settle there after having been denied lucrative land grants around Jamestown. Violence had escalated on the frontier before the rebellion. Some Doeg Indians took a few hogs to redress a debt, and the whites, retrieving the hogs, murdered 2 Indians. The Doegs then took out a war party to kill a white herdsman, after which a white militia company killed 24 Indians. This led to a series of Indian raids, with the Indians, outnumbered, turning to guerrilla warfare. The government at Jamestown declared war on the Indians, but proposed to exempt those Indians who cooperated. This seemed to anger the frontiers people, who wanted total war but also resented the high taxes assessed to pay for the war. Times were hard in 1676. It was a dry summer, ruining the corn crop, which was needed for food, and the tobacco crop, needed for foreign exchange. The great mass of people lived in severe economic straits. Governor Berkeley, in his 70s, tired of holding office, wrote wearily about his situation. How miserable that man is that governs a people where 6 parts of 7 at least are poorly indebted, discontented and armed. His phrase 6 parts of 7 suggests the existence of an upper class not so poor. In fact, there was such a class already developed in Virginia. Nathaniel Bacon, the leader of Bacon's rebellion, himself came from this class, had a good bit of land, and was probably less enthused about redressing class grievances than about killing Indians. But, as historian Howard Zinn has analyzed, he became a symbol of class. resentment against the Virginia establishment, making it through the mandate of an election to the Legislative Assembly of Virginia. When Bacon insisted on organizing armed detachments to fight the Indians outside official control, Berkeley proclaimed him a rebel and had him captured, whereupon 2,000 Virginians marched into Jamestown to support him. Berkeley let Bacon go in return for an apology, but Bacon went off, gathered his militia, and began raiding the Indians. Bacon died soon after of natural causes, and the rebellion fizzled out. A task force of 1,000 soldiers sent from England managed to subdue the rebel garrisons, comprising freemen, servants and slaves, by a combination of guile and force. At the end of the operations, 23 rebel leaders were hanged. It was a complex chain of oppression in Virginia. The Indians were plundered by literature white frontiersmen, who were pillaged by TLFE Jamestown elite. And the whole colony was being exploited by England, which bought the colonists tobacco at prices it dictated and made £100,000 a year for the king. For the masses of Virginia, however, the governor represented the most visible source of their exploitation, and as Richard Lee, a member of the Governor's Council, noted, their support of Bacon in his conflict with the governor was prompted by hopes of leveling. Leveling meant equalizing the wealth. Leveling was to be behind countless actions of poor whites against the rich in all the English colonies in the century and a half before the Revolution. The people who joined Bacon's rebellion were part of a large underclass of miserably poor whites who came to the North American colonies from European cities whose governments were anxious to be rid of them. In England, the development of commerce and capitalism in the 1500s and 1600 as the enclosing of land for the production of wool filled the cities with vagrant poor, and from the reign of Elizabeth on, laws were passed to punish them, imprison them in workhorses, or exile them. In the 1600s and 1700s by forced exile, by lures, promises, force, and by their urgent need to escape the living conditions of the home country, poor people wanting to go to America became commodities of profit for merchants, ship captains and eventually their masters in America. Abbott Smith, in his study of indentured servitude, colonists in bondage, writes, from the complex pattern of forces producing emigration to the American colonies stands out clearly as most powerful in causing the movement of servants. This was the pecuniary profit to be made by shipping them. Indentured servants were bought and sold like slaves. Servants had few rights, could not many without permission, and could be separated from their families. Beatings and whippings of servants was common. Servant women were raped, finding their situation intolerable and rebellion impractical in an increasingly organized society. Servants reacted in individual ways. Sometimes they were just lazy and disobedient. Sometimes they hit out physically at their masters. Many sought to annul their bondage through escape, and a few went on strike. But those poor whites in America who were not servants did not have an easy time either. It is quite clear that class lines hardened through the colonial period and the distinction between rich and poor became sharper. While the deprived majority scrounged around for a livelihood, the privileged minority within the nascent cities, such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, monopolized the wealth and resources of an expanding economy. Everywhere the poor were struggling to stay alive, simply to maintain themselves at a subsistence level of existence. All the cities built poorhouses in the 1730s not just for old people, orphans, widows and crippled, but for new immigrants, war veterans and unemployed. In New York, at mid-century, the city almshouse, built for 100 homeless, was housing over 400. A Philadelphia citizen wrote in 1748, "It is remarkable what an increase of the number of beggars there is about this town this winter." In 1757, Boston officials spoke of a great number of poor who can scarcely procure from day to day daily bread for themselves and their families. The colonies, it seems, were societies of contending classes, a fact obscured by the emphasis, in traditional histories, on the external struggle against England, the unity of colonists in the American Revolution. The country therefore was not born free, but born native and alien, slave and free, servant and master, poor and rich. As a result, the political authorities were opposed frequently, vociferously, and sometimes violently, according to sociologist Gary Nash. Outbreaks of disorder punctuated the last quarter of the 17th century, toppling established governments in Massachusetts, New York, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, with the existing problem of Indian hostility and the increasing danger of slave revolts, the emerging problem of the disaffection among poor whites, servants as well as otherwise, troubled the colonial elite. As the colonies passed their 100th year and went into the middle of the 1700s, as the gap between rich and poor widened, as violence and the threat of violence escalated, the problem of control became serious. What if these different despised groups, the Indians, the slaves, the poor whites, should combine? Bacon's rebellion was an especially fearsome event in the opinion of the rulers of Virginia because in it white servants and black slaves joined forces. The final surrender was by 400 English and Negroes in arms at one Gamson and 300 freemen and African and English bondservants in another garrison. The naval commander who subdued the 400 wrote, "Most of them persuaded to go to their homes, which accordingly they did, except about 80 Negroes and 20 English which would not deliver their arms." A significant F-tour which came in the way of such subaltern unity on a wider scale was the development, by the end of the third quarter of the 18th century, of a white middle class, formed in the new cities, of independent farmers and moneyed tradespeople, who, given some rewards for making common cause with merchants and planters, would be a solid buffer against poor whites, slaves and Indians. These middle-class Americans might be invited to join a new elite by, on the one hand, being assured protection against competition from members of other races and, on the other hand, being seduced with aspirations of emulating the established rich. The Pennsylvania Journal wrote in a typical piece in 1756, "The people of this province are generally of the middling sort, and at present prey much upon a level. They are chiefly industrious farmers, artificers or men in trade. They enjoy and are fond of freedom, and the meanest among them thinks he has a right to civility from the greatest." Indeed, there was already a substantial middle class fitting that description, not only in Pennsylvania but in most other states of America. But to call them the people, as did the Pennsylvania Journal, was to omit the displaced Indians, the black slaves and the desperate poor whites. The contexts of these ignored groups were hardly ever considered in dominant accounts of the American literature canon, although it was through the very process of their marginalization that the canonical texts and context of American literature, as we have known them over decades, and established themselves as such. 4.5 Summary. In this unit, I have tried to account for some other contexts of American literature, which the Puritan context, till recently taken as the only context of this literature, managed to sideline and even suppress. These include the Quaker context, the Indian context, the black context and the poor white context, all of which, in their very marginalization, made possible the projection exclusively of the Puritan context of American literature. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.